Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ulrich Kuhn, the Consulate General of Switzerland here in Atlanta. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you together with my wife Marie-Claire here in Atlanta in the German Cultural Center to this birthday celebration of Leonhard Euler, possibly the most brilliant Swiss mathematician and scientist ever. At this point, actually, I would like to thank my colleague and deputy Daniel Grünenfelder. He has made this event possible. And also my other colleague, Thomas Rohrer, who is over there. He is a trainee for 3 months here in Atlanta and has efficiently helped Daniel. Thank you very much, both of you. Since I'm on thanking, I would like to thank also the Goethe Institute, or now it's the German Cultural Center here in Atlanta, and its director, Wolfgang Krüger, for having opened once more the doors to us Swiss. He actually suggests that we call it now the Swiss Cultural Center. It is always very appreciated that we have this fine cooperation with the German Cultural Center. So thank you very much. Before introducing to you Professor Joy Albry, our today's guest speaker, I have the pleasure and honor to introduce you to another dignitary of the mathematical world. Professor David Stone and his wife have made it an honor to be with us tonight. David Stone is a professor with the mathematical science, with the mathematical science department at Georgia Southern University in Statesboro. With 13 years of activity, he probably holds the record for continuous membership in the Southeastern Section Executive Committee of the Mathematical Association of America. As a newsletter editor, a state director for Georgia, and a section chair and governor. Since 2003, he serves as departmental liaison on the Mathematical Association of America board, and since 2006 as sectorial governor on the Strategic Planning Working Group on Governance. He recently also has been proposed as the president, the national president of the Mathematical Association of America. Thank you so much, Professor Stone, for having come to Atlanta. And if you also agreed to explain in a nutshell what the Mathematical Association of America is all about. If I may ask you maybe to say a few words on this association.
Let me set this down. I didn't know I was going to be introduced. Are you picking this up? And we have restarts. My name is David Stone, and I would like to thank our hosts and the organizers for helping us to celebrate the year of Euler. For the Mathematical Association of America, can you hear me? So this, it's on now. I have a frog in my throat. I teach mathematics at Georgia Southern University, and I'm really pleased to be here. The Mathematical Association of America, or MAA, I'll keep calling it the MAA, is the world's largest professional organization dedicated to collegiate mathematics. So we have about 25 to 28,000 members across the country and the world at any given moment. It's hard to count. I'm a candidate for president. That's not an office you go seek. Somehow they said, would you be willing to be nominated, though the election's going on right now. So that's a toss-up. So, I don't really come here to talk about that. The mathematical community reveres Euler, and we are just really pleased that we have so many partners here to honor his memory. And let me point out another anniversary that's happening right now. Euler was born in 1707, so he would be 300 years old now. wish he were here to help us celebrate his birthday. 100 years before that, in 1607, is when English settlers landed at Jamestown on the coast in coastal Virginia. So we're celebrating the 400th anniversary of that. You know, we think that's a long time ago. In European time, you know, it's a blink in an eye. But every American school child knows about the Jamestown settlement and Pocahontas and Captain John Smith. So we learn that type of history. But almost the entire mathematics community and most mathematicians hardly know anything about their own subject. They don't know much about Euler. They don't know much about Newton. They don't know much about Fibonacci or Pythagoras. So the MAA itself has sponsored efforts recently, programs and activities to try to make this, improve the situation, I think. And let me tell you a few of the activities that the MAA has been involved in this year, which is for the MAA, 2007 is the year of Euler. In the first place, we sent every member a poster about Euler, so we have plastered the world with Euler's likenesses. These are on classrooms and on office doors all across the country and the world. I have a list here so I don't leave out something. There's a professional development workshop, The Genius of Euler, to be held at the MAA headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have a brand new conference center. Bill Dunham, who is one of the preeminent Euler historians, will conduct that workshop. In June, there was a session like this held 11 days ago in the Swiss Embassy in Washington. The International Study Tour, the MAA has a study tour each summer, and for the first 2 weeks of, I think, July, it'll be an Euler tour this year. So we'll visit his birthplace and the two cities where he worked, St. Petersburg and Berlin. Then the Math Fest, our annual meeting that happens in the summer in San Jose, will be jointly sponsored by the Euler Society. If you go to maa.org, that's our website, there's a wonderful column once a month. Ed Sandifer writes a column called How Euler Did It. So he takes one of Euler's mathematical works and almost delves into the mind of Euler. What was he thinking? What were the surroundings? What led him to approach the topic this way? What does it connect to other things that other people had done or that Euler himself had done? And, of course, the MAA has published books. There are a lot of books about Euler. The MAA has published two of them, one by Sandifer, one by Bill Dunham. This is the most recent one, The Early Mathematics of Leonhard Euler. I was reading through this week and was struck by, in 1736, Euler, just to pick a year, Euler solved the Königsberg Bridge problem. There's something about it on one of the posters outside. Solved the Königsberg Bridge problem, which essentially initiated the study of graph theory as a mathematical topic. In the same year, he proved Euler's theorem in number theory, which is the foundation for the public key cryptography that makes internet security perfectly safe today. So all in 1736. What a good year. And he had a lot of good years. Let me thank our hosts again for having this, and let me thank the Swiss for sharing Euler with the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Professor Stone. Some of you may know that this year, 2007, the Swiss consulates and the Swiss embassy in Washington, the Swiss consulates in the United States, are celebrating an event which is called Think Swiss, Brainstorm the Future. You have the big banner over there. This activity is actually is thought of bringing Switzerland in another light than so far. Everybody knows Switzerland by chocolate and cheese and so on, but Switzerland has much more to offer. And this time we really would like to emphasize the Swiss achievements in education, science, and research, innovation also. And there are 12 main topics which you will find on the website thingswiss.org. I really can recommend you to go on this website and check what Switzerland has to offer in environment, in public transportation, financial center, and one of these events is Euler, the 300th anniversary of Leonhard Euler. So, without further ado, I now wish to introduce to you Professor Joy Albury, a mathematician from Auburn University in Montgomery, Alabama. He came tonight with his lovely wife, and I thank him very much for having made this trip to Atlanta, because it's not really a suburb from Atlanta to come from Montgomery. Professor Albury was very supportive from the beginning of this project, of this idea to celebrate Leonhard Euler's 300th anniversary. And I thank him very much for letting us discover our birthday celebrity a bit more intimately. Besides being a professor for mathematics at Auburn University and director of the pre-engineering program in the same university, Joy Albury is also a historian of the southeastern branch of the MAA. Just a couple of weeks ago, he wrote a paper about Euler's letters to a German princess, a topic I believe he will also elaborate on tonight. So please welcome Professor Albury.
I was going to say a word or so about his parents. His father went to the University of Basel and was a mathematics student for a short time of Jakob Bernoulli, who I'll show you just a little bit more about in a minute. But his father mainly studied theology, was ordained a minister, and in the year before Leonhard Euler was, the year after Leonhard Euler was born, he assumed the pastorate of a church in Rien. Rien is, I guess, a suburb now of Basel. At the time, it was very much in the country. It's been remarked that he was raised a country boy, Leonhard was. He went to school in Basel at the University of Basel, and he was the oldest of 4 children. And the talk this evening will focus on the 4 periods of his life. This has been alluded to. I think David Stone and other people have mentioned that he lived in Basel, grew up in Basel, got his formal education in Basel, but he spent 2 periods in St. Petersburg, and the longest contiguous period of his life was spent in Berlin. We mentioned that he is immense. His productivity is immense. In 1909, the Swiss Academy of Sciences established an Euler Committee, and in 1911, they started producing his published works, or reproducing his published works. And as you can see, there are 76 volumes, and all of them are like the Manhattan phone book. They are immense. But that's not all. There are the letters, and they are not finished. There are 2 volumes still to go. And the manuscripts, which they project will be 7 more volumes when they get them done. At this time, a man named Gustav Ennerström, who I believe was Swedish, not Swiss, came to Basel and decided that he would make a catalog of all of Euler's published works you see the title of the work, and then you see E, and then a number, like you would see a library catalog. So every one of Euler's published works has an Ennerstrom number. Ennerstrom got up to 866, but that's a fudge number. 850 to 860 is probably as close as we're going to get accurately. There were a few letters and things that we might argue about. All right, Leonhard matriculated at the University of Basel, and his mathematics teacher was Johann Bernoulli. We can almost get that. We can get all that on. Johann Bernoulli was the younger brother of Jakob Bernoulli, who was Euler's father's math professor at Basel. At this particular time, we're talking about roughly the early 1720s, 1721, 22, 23. Johann Bernoulli was probably the most important mathematician in all of Europe. Isaac Newton was an old man at this time. He had stopped his scientific work. He died in 1727, so he was still alive. Leibniz had died in 1716. He's off the stage. There were several disciples of Isaac Newton's who were, what shall I say, promoting Newtonian philosophy and mathematics and so forth. But the most important mathematician at this time was Johann Bernoulli the first, and he was Euler's professor. And he recognized Euler's talent. When Euler finished his master's degree at the University of Basel, Johann Bernoulli recognized his talent and allowed him to have special lessons on Saturdays. This ran against his father's wishes, because his father, of course, wanted him to become a pastor and to go to the faculty of theology, as he had done. But the die was cast, and under Johann Bernoulli's tutelage, Euler began to develop. To give an indication of a brief indication, in the picture here you see an illustration of it's an upside down illustration, or it's right side up for the subject of the brachistochrone problem, which is one of the most famous problems of Johann Bernoulli was associated with. So was Isaac Newton and other great mathematicians. It's a geometry problem which is solved using calculus. The Bernoulli family were, I guess, like the Bach family in a sense. They were generations of fine musicians. Here they're generations of fine mathematicians, physicists, engineers, scientists. Leonhard Euler was a colleague, a companion, if you will, with Nicholas and with Daniel. They were friends. Well, while he was in Basel, Euler started to work right away with Johann Bernoulli's tutelage in doing mathematics and physics. And his first major work was this. What is somebody in Switzerland doing writing on ships? The Swiss Navy is not exactly famous. But this is a great work. This work was stimulated by the Paris Academy. The Paris Academy had a very fairly judged prize. You could enter the essay anonymously. So if you were somebody famous and your essay was not very good, it would be eliminated. If you were someone who was barely beyond being a student, as Leonhard Euler was at this time, and his essay was good, it won the second place. And you see it's very early in his work. Mostly the Ennerstrom numbers are chronological. Not quite exactly, but mostly chronological in publication. This, if you think about this in terms of fiction, you would call this a novella, I think. It's 52 pages. And I think in your advertisement, or your announcement, it said something about the masts of ships, the design of the masts of ships, also the design of sails, also the design of the shape of the hull is covered in this work. Well, at this time, Peter the Great in Russia had conquered many lands, had enlarged his kingdom, and he wanted to make his kingdom as more European than it was, than it had been. And he consulted with Leibniz on 3 occasions. And on each of those occasions, he was told to start some kind of a science academy. And he finally did, at the same time as he was constructing his new city, where the Neva River empties into the Gulf of Finland, which we now call St. Petersburg. In most of my lifetime, it was called Leningrad, of course. But that's a new city constructed by Peter the Great. And he decided he would construct an academy. Unfortunately, he died before it could be built, but his widow saw the academy's construction through, and there is a picture of it as it faces the Neva River. Now that's a steel engraving from sometime in the 18th century. I don't know exactly when, but I would say quite impressive. Well, Peter wanted Johann Bernoulli to be the president of his new academy. At this time, however, Johann Bernoulli was approaching 60 years of age, too old to move all the way from Basel to St. Petersburg. In a certain way, I can think of that as being going out to the frontier, because of a brand new city and sort of raw countryside in a way, developing countryside. But he recommended his sons, Nicholas and Daniel. They went as a couple of the first professors recruited to the St. Petersburg Academy. The St. Petersburg Academy had its own annual research journal, the Commentary. I think it came out annually. When Nicholas and Daniel got to St. Petersburg, they informed their friend, Leonhard Euler, that this would be a marvelous place to come. And through their good offices, the invitation was extended to Leonhard Euler to come to St. Petersburg as an élève. An élève is a student. Any of the students speak French? That's what I know it as French. Does it mean something else in Russian? I don't know. But Leonhard Euler was hired barely, got his foot in the door as a student. There was political turmoil after Euler arrived, not due to anything he did. There was political turmoil because Catherine, the widow, died. And then there was a coup d'etat. And a lot of the foreigners were run off. And what that meant for Leonhard Euler was a fortuitous vacuum. So he advanced very quickly from being, Thomas less than an intern. He advanced very quickly. Quite tragically, Nicholas died of a fever. Daniel left in 1731 and returned to Basel to take his father's position at the University of Basel. Euler became the professor of physics 1 year. The next year he became the professor of mathematics. That's promoted very rapidly. In St. Petersburg, Euler's first masterpiece is what it's called. His Mechanics was published. Now, I have not read this, but I suspect that if a real scholarly study was made of this, that this is the work of Leonhard Euler and to some extent perhaps Daniel Bernoulli as well. They collaborated on a lot of things. They had a lot of interests from their school days at the University of Basel and afterward. Daniel Bernoulli is known to me as an engineering student 40-some-odd years ago for the Bernoulli equations in fluid mechanics. It's the foundation of fluid mechanics. Well, Leonhard Euler also wrote on fluid mechanics. I think they were partners in many ways, and it only says Leonhard Euler here, but I think that this book is probably somewhat the work of now this is speculation on my part because I haven't read it. It uses more calculus than the mechanics books and works of its day. After this book, the practice is very common that mechanics is split into a geometric study and then what is called analytical mechanics. Analytical mechanics was the title of textbooks through the 18th century and well into the 19th, in the middle of the 19th century. And again, a detailed study of this, I think, would probably show that this is the starting point for that. This was Euler's first masterpiece. Well, the Russian Academy was very stable during the 1730s. It was a wonderful place to work for Leonhard Euler. He got promoted very rapidly. He became, I won't say wealthy, but he became settled and comfortable. Time to take a wife. So he did. And he married, it's not a bite? I don't know. He married a wonderful lady, Katharina Zell. Now, her father was a Swiss artist who was in the court of St. Petersburg. They were married in either 1733 or 1734, and I don't know which because I don't know if they were using the old Julian calendar or the new calendar. They were married in the winter there, right around Christmas. Do you know? No, I don't know.
But I know.
You know the story. Okay. They started having children right away. Their oldest son, Johann Albrecht, was born about a year or so later. They had 13 children, 5 of whom lived to be adults. Life was tough in the 18th century. In addition to his mathematics and physics, mechanics, and that sort of thing, another habit of Leonhard Euler's, which just adds to his immensity, is that he did many other jobs, significant, non-trivial jobs. One of them I know a little bit about because I've studied a little bit about the history of geography. Joseph Nicolas de Lille, who came from a very famous French family of geographers, like the Bernoullis, a son, a grandson, sort of brothers and uncles and so forth, all geographers. Joseph Nicolas de Lille was recruited from Paris by Peter the Great to head the St. Petersburg Astronomical School. Well, when he arrived in St. Petersburg, he then took over the Academy's geography department. And all of the lands that Peter the Great had conquered had to be mapped. So he had a number of deputies and surveyors, and one of whom I think is a familiar name, the name of Bering. We know the Bering Sea. Well, he was one of de Lille's deputies. Bering was the person who discovered that California California was not an island. Those were explorers. Those were deputies. Those were people who surveyed a lot of land, many of which belonged to Peter the Great, at least he thought so. Who made the maps? Leonhard Euler, using spherical trigonometry and all the other projective geometry, the mathematics. This is a full-time job itself. And Leonhard Euler was one of Delisle's deputies. Well, with the death of the Tsarina Anna in 1704, there was another coup in St. Petersburg. Foreigners were not appreciated. For some reason, many of the buildings originally built in St. Petersburg were made of wood. Perhaps there were many forests up there that they cut down. I don't know why, but that meant that they had fires. People they didn't like, they built fires around their house. Or they torched the houses, put the houses on fire. Katerina was running the household and raising a young family. She was very afraid, and by good fortune, Frederick the Great of Prussia had offered Euler a position, so he took it. Frederick the Great made Leonhard Euler his head mathematician. Oh, I have this upside down. Sorry. Frederick the Great, a lot can be said of Frederick the Great. And I bow to Mr. Kruger here, who knows much more than I do. We know, of course, he was a fine musician, played the flute. His kingdom in Prussia enlarged under his rule considerably, and he started this academy, the Academy of Arts and Letters. He was a Francophile. He courted Voltaire to be the president of his academy. Everything that got published in his academy had to be done in French, which was quite strange because Euler wrote most everything in Latin. About 80% of his work is in Latin. At any rate, I think that Frederick the Great didn't know much about math, and Leonhard Euler was not really the kind of man who fit into the court in Berlin. The court in Berlin under Frederick was very French, and Euler was a plain man. He did not entertain frills and fancy things. He was, I guess, like his father in that way. A pastor's son, you can think of him that way. At any rate, I think that for Frederick, Euler was as much a decoration as he was a notch in the gun, perhaps, if you will. He was certainly very famous, so it would be a great source of pride for Frederick to have such a great mathematician as Leonhard Euler as a member of his court. But that didn't say that he and Frederick knew each other very well, or really had much personal contact, or they were very much alike. Now, if somebody asked me what is the most important work of all 850 or 60 or however many you're counting works that Euler ever wrote, I would say it's the Introductio, the introduction to the analysis of the infinite. Published in Lausanne, not in Berlin, so it could be published in Latin. Many people call this Euler's first calculus book. And I think this is really wrong, and let me see if I can explain that to you. For the students, here comes your math. But we'll try to make it gentle for those who are not mathematicians. Let us just concentrate on one chapter, Chapter 8, trigonometry. Most of us have had trigonometry in high school. Euler starts, notice the word transcendental, important. Euler starts his trigonometry We have to know what pi is. 130 decimal places without any calculators or computers, maybe counting on his toes. I don't know. But 130 decimal places. I count them. That's true. And Euler, the important lesson here, especially for the students, Euler recognizes that this is not correct. This is only an approximation. Pi is transcendental in the sense that it's beyond a rational number. Now, in today's graduate mathematics world, Professor Harrington, Professor Stone, and I have sloshed our way through. We know that transcendental has its own meaning, but that's a 19th and 20th century concept. Transcendental here for Leonhard Euler means it's not going to be rational. No matter how many more, you can do another 130 decimal places, and it isn't going to work. Here's the way Leonhard Euler defined the trig functions, which was the standard way in which it was done in his day. The trig functions were not called trig functions, they were called trigonometric lines. The sign of the arc here is this line. You see? This line here is tangent to the circle. So that's why we call that line W, we call that the tangent. With a little bit of algebra, we know that the equation of this circle is u squared plus v squared equals 1. U squared plus v squared equals 1 gives us the most fundamental of all the trig identities. If you think of the small triangle together with this larger triangle, you immediately recognize that the angles are all equal correspondingly. So those are similar triangles. So the corresponding parts are in the same ratio. And that gives you that elementary trig identity. I expect all the students to recognize it. Those who have not been students for a few years might not recognize it. But any trigonometric textbook, contemporary or otherwise, would confirm this. And if you go back to the circle and put your angle right here, then the sine is the opposite over the hypotenuse, and the cosine is the adjacent over the... You just get the same trig that we all know and love from our high schools and our contemporary experience. Well, Euler goes on to establish standard identities that, again, appear in our textbooks. The top ones here are very common. When I teach trig, everyone has to know these. I think that this one here is very, very simple. The way I think of it is you think of the sine curve, and if you move it pi over 2 to the left and superimpose it, you get the cosine curve. The others are the same way. But Leonhard Euler being Leonhard Euler, he said, these are just as easy. This is typical of the book, the Introductio. This is typical of a number of Euler's books. You open the books, and the formulas just sort of spill out on the page. You want to close it quick so they don't get away. This is Euler. He goes on, and I think the most fundamental, the most important equations in the whole trigonometry chapter are these. Now, those of us who have had calculus know that these are the infinite series expressions for the cosine and the sine. Please understand that this v is not the same as the v on the circle. He's changed the variables several times since in proving all of these identities. This is what Euler means when he says sines and cosines, not the original. That is a fundamental shift. It's fundamental because it's what? It's transcendental. It goes on infinitely. From these building blocks now, He can do simple things, like establish this infinite series, which has been known to Leibniz, but now it's just a very simple corollary of his way of thinking of the trig functions. And if you like that one, he'll have a few more. We all remember high school factoring and algebra. Well, Euler shows us that we can factor the trig functions. Transcendentally, of course, because in algebra in high school, we factor a quadratic and we get two factors. We factor a third-degree polynomial and we get three factors. Well, we've got an infinite number of factors here. In Alabama and in Georgia, we would say, Euler was a calculating fool. I think Francois Arago, one of the most famous the physicists of the 19th century in L'École Polytechnique, says it better. This is a common quote that is on your invitation. Once again, this is what Euler's trying to do in the Introductio. He's trying to, those are my emphases now of the word functions. He's trying to reformulate calculus in terms of functions. This is really his pre-calculus. Calculus, if you remember, those of you who had it maybe 20 or 30 years ago, consisted of derivatives and integrals. Euler's books on derivatives and integrals took several years to write and several more years to produce and get published. These books are mammoth. I have not seen the differential calculus, but I have seen and looked at the integral calculus, and again, it's like 3 Manhattan books. And it contains not just integral calculus, it contains all the differential equations practically that we teach in our first courses today in American colleges and universities. Calculus of variations and other subjects would now flow from calculus. They're all in here. So I think that of all the works that Euler ever wrote, this has to be the most important. Later in life, this caused him to reformulate the mechanics, and he published a second mechanics. And I have not studied it, but I would suspect very strongly that his second mechanics is a reformulation based on the calculus that he developed from all of this. The Introductio, that's what he called it, right? The introduction. This isn't calculus yet. It's the introduction. Well, I mentioned that, and it's common knowledge that Frederick played the flute. Leonhard Euler played the clavier. Music was another one of his pleasant pastimes. I don't know with his production. How did he have time for music? Who knows? And I should also say, just in passing, that yes, he took on many other jobs for Frederick, as he had done in St. Petersburg. He was the manager of the botanical garden. Let me see, I've got one more that's I had to do. Oh, yes. He supervised as an engineer the construction of 17 locks on the Finneau Canal that connects the Oder River with the Havel River. And the result of that was that at that time, Berlin had access to the sea, to the Baltic Sea. I've never been to Berlin, but anybody who's been to Berlin, do you think of Berlin as having the sea? I don't think so, anyway. He bought an estate in Charlottenburg, a suburb of Berlin. He moved his widowed mother there from Frankfurt. His father died in 1745. For health reasons, the president of the Berlin Academy, Pierre Maupertuis, who had to be French, of course, but was a very reputable scientist. For health reasons, Maupertuis left Berlin in 1753, and Euler took over his job, running the academy. Maupertuis never came back. He died in 1759, and when he died, Euler really was the I guess you would call him ambassador without portfolio. He was the de facto head of the Berlin Academy, but he never became the head of the Berlin Academy. I mentioned that Euler played the clavier, but he did not, I don't think he ever played with Frederick. Instead, he made friends with the Margrave Friedrich Heinrich von Brandenburg-Schwed, who had his own dominion just outside of Berlin that was coveted by Frederick, so there was a rivalry there. Leonhard Euler would go out to the Margrave's castle, and they would play their music and enjoy each other's company. And while they did that, Leonhard Euler made the acquaintance of the Margrave's older daughter, Sophie Charlotte Frederique Leopoldine von Brandenburg-Schwed. Charlotte was the German princess. From April 19th, 1760 to a little after May 18th, 1762. In other words, just about a month more than 2 years. Euler wrote 234 letters in French to Charlotte and kept copies for himself. She was 15 years old when they started. A smart girl. The letters were about 2 a week, approximately 9 or 10 or 12 a month, and they're very steady, if you notice the dates. In other words, he doesn't gang up and write a bunch of letters, say one every day for a month so he can take a month off. No. He just, like clockwork, Swiss clockwork. The letters were published in St. Petersburg after he left Berlin. And here's just a brief review of the publishing history, of a little bit of the publishing history. Emil Fellman has just been published a book that I think has been around for a good while. It's been translated into English, a biography of Leonhard Euler. It's not an MAA book, so David Stone could not mention it. But it's a very fine biography. Fellman is one of the world's experts. Fellman is from Basel, one of the world's experts on Leonhard Euler. He claims there are 111 editions of the Letters to a German Princess that have been published since 1768. I'm using this one. This one is in 2 volumes. So when I reference the letters, I will say volume 1 such and such, and that's not the way they were originally published. Okay. Euler gets right down to business. The very first letter, he says, I'm very sorry that I couldn't give you these lessons in person. But for us, thank goodness he couldn't. Because if he had, we never would have had the letters, of course. Anyway, he gets right down to business, and I'm going to quote occasionally here from them. He begins by fixing some one determinate division of measure obvious to the senses. Mathematicians, I think, squint up when they hear that, but as an engineer, to me, it's just a scale. And then he talks about the real numbers. The real numbers are used to measure everything from the smallest to the largest extensions of matter, from the heavens to a grain of sand. And the last sentence in this letter, the first letter now, this immensity is the work of the Almighty who governs the greatest bodies and the smallest. Leonhard Euler is like a friendly uncle to Charlotte. He's playing several roles. He's a friendly uncle. He's a scientist. She's a smart girl. smart young lady. She's learning all of this as a 15, 16-year-old. How many of you students could have learned a lot of this as 15? Think about where you were age 15 or 16. This is what I wanted. It's very hard to break the letters down into topics because most of the letters feature a very nice transition, if you will, from one subject to the next. He makes it almost like a Dickens novel. He whets your appetite for the next letter in each one. Where do I run? I've got a couple of places where he says this. Oh yes, at the start of the third letter, this is in volume 1 of my edition, of course, which doesn't correspond to his 3 volumes, but his third letter, Euler observed that his previous discussion of velocity would, quote, carry me forward to the examination of sound. Well, you see, the velocity of sound was something fairly new at that time, and he wants to get into sound. And as soon as he gets into sound, he gets into vibrations. And then he has a letter on the clavier. And the last letter on these is about deriving the pleasures from fine music. So the friendly uncle now is going to talk about J.S. Bach or Couperin, or who would he be? Well, whose music would he have been playing at this time? You see. At any rate, then from the explanation of sound, let me carry you forward into a more particular consideration of air. While he's talking about the physics of all of this, he also talks about the metaphysics of all this, the philosophy, we would say. And on and on and on. You see some letters here on light. Well, one of the things that he did was he just demolished, other people had done it as well, but he demolished Isaac Newton's particular theory of light. This cannot happen. If light were particles, then over time the sun would shrink. Have you noticed the sun being any smaller lately? No. A piece of glass, how does a particle go through a piece of glass? Impossible. Newton wanted the heavens to be a vacuum. Well, you can't have it both ways. Either it's a vacuum or if it's got particles in it. If it's got something in it, it's no longer a vacuum. And then after he's gone through this argument, at the end of the letter, he writes this. This is a generous man. This is a man who recognizes genius, of course. Isaac Newton was a genius. He does not want to be disrespectful to his student of Isaac Newton. He's teaching not just physics and science, he's teaching life. Oh, I want to call your attention to letters 64, I better look them up, 64 through 80, special letters. And I have to tell you why they are special. Here are the letters 64 through 80. Flux and reflux refer to the tides. And his family, that their Charlottenburg home would be safe. The Russians had plenty of other things they could beat up on in Berlin. They wouldn't touch the Euler family. Someone didn't get the message, and Euler's home was sacked. His furniture was burned. All of his farm animals were killed, and Toplenberg was ashamed. He personally paid for the rebuilding of the house and the refurnishing of the house. And the empress at that time, she added 4,000 rubles. Euler was revered in St. Petersburg, even though he was a foreigner. And they had to make this right. All of that happened in October of 1760. There are 9 letters here. And at this time also, I used the Euler archive online and did a very short little statistical summary. From 1758 to 1767, that's 10 years that encompasses this, Euler averaged a little over 11 publications a year. It didn't slow him down. So students, every time you say that the dog ate my homework or something, you know why we're not listening? Well, let me move on to something else that I think will register with the students. These last letters here on language, thought, and propositions sort of stand out because a lot of this material, you can see these letters here, gosh, you've got almost 50 of them, in which most of them are about metaphysics and philosophy, not about science. I'll have something more to say about that in a minute. But the language, thought, and proposition letters were all about what we teach our students are called Venn diagrams. They shouldn't be called Venn diagrams, and every once in a while we'll see a textbook where they get it right. They're called Euler circles. I think this is where Euler invented them. This took about 2 weeks to teach all of this to Charlotte. And I don't think we get through the first row in most of our college classes today. Charlotte was a smart young lady, and Euler was a good teacher. Well, as I was saying, these letters were getting more and more speculative and philosophical in our sense. Philosophy, you understand, in the 18th century, philosophy meant physics. Philosophy meant science. It didn't mean aesthetics or some of the things which we think of today. The letters continue this way down to letter 17. And here's the story of what happened. In May of 1761, Euler visited the Margrave in his castle, and I assume played music and so forth, enjoyed his stay in a normal visit. But Charlotte caught him, took him aside, and complained that the lessons were not scientific enough. They were too speculative. She wasn't learning what she wanted, which was the science. Euler got the message. Letter 18 is a continuation of one of his earlier letters explaining colors. And the rest of the subjects, you can see, really are physics. There really is a change there. This is not one of the places where there's a continuation, like I talked about earlier. The letters on electricity are very interesting because this is the time when Benjamin Franklin was doing it, had just passed the time when Benjamin Franklin was doing electricity. He sent letters to Peter Collinson in London at the Royal Society explaining what he had done. I'm talking about Benjamin Franklin now. Peter Collinson gathered these letters into a book. The book was published in 1752 and immediately translated into French and Dutch and widely disseminated. But Euler never saw it. He explained electricity, some features of electricity to Charlotte. He even showed her this. Now, this is from my 1839 edition. I don't know if it's in the original edition or not. The Euler Archive doesn't have the original edition. You turn the crank here, and there's gearing to this glass ball, which is on the axis AB. So you turn the crank maybe once, and the glass ball rotates maybe 5 times or more. Attached to a spring here is a little platform with a piece of wool cloth. And as the glass goes over the wool cloth, it produces static electricity, which is picked off by the wire brush that goes onto an iron wire. And of course, the circuit is completed when someone gets a shock. And Benjamin Franklin was famous for not only his scientific work, but he was famous for being a craftsman. He was a tinkerer. He made things. Did Euler make this? I have no idea. Was this illustration even included in the original letters? Again, I have no idea. I don't know in this country where we have in the United States, where we have an original 1768 set of the letters in French. I'd like to think that Euler did, or maybe Charlotte herself was talented enough to make something like this. Talking about a smart young lady. Euler went on and explained the Leyden jar. The Leyden jar was a capacitor, and he explained this he explained this in a rudimentary way. But that was one of the features of Benjamin Franklin's work, that he did a number of experiments with Leyden jars. Euler didn't know anything about them, and when Euler finished this explanation, he actually says to Charlotte, "This is all I know about electricity." He does not know about Benjamin Franklin. Isn't that too bad? Because, that would have been terrific. Well, these letters, I have to tell you one more thing about these letters, and then we have to move on. One of Euler's major scientific achievements was his study of the moon, his astronomical work. And one of the things that he presented, I don't have time to give you much detail here. One of the greatest scientific problems of the 18th century, especially with the English, was the determination of longitude at sea. Very tough problem. And John Harrison's clock was the winner of the competition in England to solve this problem, at least practically, for ships. Euler gives Charlotte 5 different methods of determining longitude at sea. His favorite is by lunars, using some of his moon the tables that were made from his moon work, and published by Tobias Meyer in Germany. Well, Euler realized that Frederick was not going to entertain any way for him to prosper anymore in Berlin, because Leonhard Euler was a plain man. He was not a court kind of person. And at this time, Catherine the Great in Russia asked Euler to come back to St. Petersburg. At this time, Euler's family numbered 14, with children and grandchildren and so forth. There were 4 servants. He had a very extended household. They carried on negotiations for a good while because he had to have a big house. He had to provide for all of these people. They negotiated amicably and respectfully, and on Christmas Eve of 1765, Euler received official word from St. Petersburg that he was welcome, his conditions were met, and he should come. It took him 6 months to get out of his contract with Frederick. It took him 5 of those 6 months to even get an acknowledgement from Frederick that he wanted to leave. Finally, Frederick wrote him a one-liner, says, "Yes, you can go." And on June 1st, 1766, 1766, the Euler family left in a caravan for St. Petersburg. They stopped in Warsaw, and the Polish king gave them an official state greeting. They stopped in Riga and other places, and they had parades and parties. And there was a, quote, triumphant reception when they got to St. Petersburg. And Euler was installed, among other things, as the rector of the St. Petersburg Academy, which I guess means that he was the president of the academy. He went to work and published a lot of the things that he had done in Berlin, which didn't want to publish in French. The most popular of all of the things he published in his whole life was this algebra book. Now, I have read this algebra book. This is a masterful textbook. This algebra book is, if you can believe it, even more popular than the letters. Whoops, this is his house. This is his second house. I'll tell you about that in a minute. This blew my mind. Recklam's Universal Library sold 108 copies of this book between 1883 and 1942. In 1942, this was being used as a textbook. Catherine had provided a nice house for the Euler family. It burned. She built them another, except for the top floor. The top floor was added in the 19th century. Euler lost the sight of his right eye when he was in Berlin due to a fever. When he left Berlin, he was developing a cataract in his left eye. He got to St. Petersburg. It was surgically removed. Things went well for a short while, and then infection or something set in, and he was nearly blind, but not entirely. He worked on a blackboard, a slate, and he had a collection of secretaries, assistants, I don't know exactly what you would call them in today's world. One of them was his son, Johann Albrecht. Another was a man named Nicholas Fuss, who was Swiss, and who came to St. Petersburg, and who published the first biography of Euler. This is a very small, not a full book, but a very small biography of Euler. Produced over 400 scientific works in this last period in St. Petersburg. Over 200 of them were still left unpublished by the time he died. And Nicholas Fuss and Johann Albrecht started getting them published. But they didn't live to see the end of the publication stream. The last work of Leonhard Euler's, scientific work of Leonhard Euler's, was published in 1844. 60 years after he died. His last major work was this. Sounds like the first work that he published, in a way, on ships. The man from Switzerland is still a naval engineer. In 1781, when Euler was an old man, a marble bust was made of him. This bust was the basis for this plaque, which I have read was put up in 1960 on the church at Riem that Euler's father served so faithfully for 40-some years. Mathematician, physicist, engineer, astronomer, and philosopher who spent in his youngest years in Riem and was a great scholar and a good human being. In 76 years, with over 850 mathematical and scientific works, Leonhard Euler surely transcended landlocked Switzerland. Thank you. questions if I can. I'd like to. I have, if you wish, not a real bibliography, but a list of sources that students can use, sources that lay people can use to learn more about Euler, and in the class down here, C, more scholarly works, one of which Professor Stone has a copy of, the Ancestor for Early Mathematics of Euler. If you want to look at that book, you can corner Professor Stone. I think I have enough here. If you want one, everybody can have one. But as I said, I'd be glad to try to answer whatever questions I can.
Did he speak Russian? Will?
Yes, he certainly did. He wrote a lot of letters in Russian. Certainly he was fluent in Russian, yes. He wrote, I think he wrote some textbooks and things in Russian as well. Yes, ma'am. Did he speak Russian? And the answer is yes, very definitely.
So he wrote these letters to Charlotte every 3 or 4 days. Did she respond? I mean, how did he know that she was understanding?
How did Charlotte respond, or I think the only way was to visit the Margrave, play the clavier, and chat and so forth. Now, I don't know of any responses, although some may turn up when the letters are finished being published. Yes. Oh.
Is it true that Euler was the inventor of Sudoku?
Sudoku. Well, no, I don't think he was the inventor of Sudoku, but I can tell you what I think is the basis for Sudoku, or the basis for playing Sudoku, which comes from one of his most famous papers that's discussed by Professor Sandifer in his book. I anticipated a question like this. There's Sudoku. Does anybody not know Sudoku? It's in today's newspapers. I don't play Sudoku, but it's a fairly easy game, I think. But then, yes, exactly, but I don't play. The rules say that in every row and in every column, the numbers must be different, 1 through 9, and that means they all have to add up to 45. And the same in each one of these regions, I think is what they're called. So, if you think of the Sudoku board as a matrix, with the blank places X's, and the known numbers, the given numbers, you see, you write them in. I also call them A's, to have a name for them. Now, look across the top row. Across the top row, well, maybe I should leave this up here. I hate taking this plaque off. I'll put the plaque up. That plaque is so handsome. If you just add the numbers up, but then gather the known numbers and put them first. And I call them A. Whatever you, big A. Now, they're going to be different in every row. So subtract them off. So you have the sum of the blanks, of the unknown numbers, equals to 45 minus the known numbers. And we'll call that S for the Sudoku number. Right? Now, Euler's paper in chapter 48, I think, of the book, Ed Sandifer's book, is about partitions. Partitions are, you take an integer and you say, how many ways can you find of writing that integer as a sum of smaller positive integers? Well, positive integers, the trivial one is to take the number itself. Take the number 6. There are 4 ways of writing 6 as in a partition, partitioning 6. So what we want to do is we want to partition this number S into In this case, you've got 6 unknown numbers. And the S here for that top row is 30, because 6 and 7 and 2 is 15. You subtract that off. So we want to be concrete about it. We want to take the number 30 and partition it. How many ways can we do this? This is the subject of Euler's paper. Well, never anyone to do things by halves, Euler decided that he would solve this problem by infinite series. And it actually solved it by an infinite product. And if you write down every term of the product, when you get to the 6th exponent, that's the number of partitions of 6. 5 is the number of partitions of 7. 6 is the number of partitions of 8. So all we have to do is go out to the 30th exponent, and we get the number of partitions of 30. Now, you've still got lots more to do to solve the Sudoku puzzle, but this is the start of it. Does that answer your question? Are you ready for the test? We won't impose a test. There's still a great deal of work to do, what I call trial and error work. For this number here in particular. Okay, it can't be 6, it can't be 7, it can't be 2, because they're already in the line here. But it also can't be 9, it can't be 6, it can't be 8, it can't be 7, because it has to be in this line also. But it also can't be 6, it can't be 7, it can't be 9, because it has to be one of the 1 through 9s there. Now you're down to about 3 or 4 numbers left over, and that takes care of the first one. And you do the same game for these others and look at the partitions. Not all the partitions, because all you want is the partitions with 6 distinct integers to add up. You're coming at the problem from 2 sides to do it this way.
Thank you.
Okay. This is the marble bust that was made when Euler was an old man. You'll notice in almost every portrait or other picture of Euler, he's shown from his left side, because his right eye was blinded so relatively early in the 1750s. And he never really was completely blind. He wrote in chalk, and then he had these assistants to copy for him 400 works in St. Petersburg. He did not slow down. Well, that's almost half of his production in the last a few years of his life.
Did people take dictation in those days?
I have no idea. No, do people take dictation? No, he wrote on this chalkboard, as I understand it, and then they copied and helped produce his work. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to comment that I know a teeny bit about Euler, and I could never deliver a wonderful lecture like this. I don't have an affinity for it, but there's one thing I'd like to bring out that I don't think you brought out, and that is that Euler was a really nice guy. Euler was doing his bench. Yeah. Euler would do things like share prizes with younger students,
Yes.
and then not take his share of the prize when he wins a competition or a contest. Give it to the younger students. And sitting around in his chair, and grandchildren all crawling all over him, working mathematics. Just what a wonderful view.
Yep. He was. The point was being made that Euler was really a very fine human being in many, many respects. And one of the particular details that you mentioned, well, where did Euler get his start? Trying to solve a problem from the Paris Academy and win a contest. He won, I don't remember how many Paris Academy prizes, something like 8, 14, or something like that. But he shared prizes with students. And as you point out, when he shared the prize, instead of splitting the money, he left it to, quite often he left it to the student. And we can probably tell all sorts of stories of that sort. I recommend very highly this biography by Emil Feldman, which has just been published this January. The book has been around for a number of years, and it's just been translated into English. So I think perhaps if you go home to Basel or Zurich, you may find a Swiss version of this, which dates back 5, 10, 15 years or more. But now it's available in English, in public, and distributed in the United States by Elsevier. That's a very fine book. Sir?
What about this book that you mentioned, Letters to Princess? The last publication was 1839?
Oh, no. That's the last publication, was the last publication of the Letters to the German Princess, 1839? No, that's just the one that I'm using. I think you can buy a copy of it today. I have not seen it, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised if you went to the online books in print that you might find it, a reprint. And it's in all sorts of languages, Swedish and Dutch and Spanish and probably every European language, Greek. Yes, sir.
Do we know what happened to Charlotte von Brandenburg-Schmidt? Did she become a scientist?
Yes. Well, she did not become a scientist, but she did scientific work. What happened to Charlotte when Charlotte grew up? Well, she was a princess, so she had to marry and be a part of a court and that sort of thing. But she never lost her love of science, and she did it just as an amateur. Now she was not going to be a member of Frederick's Academy. She wasn't French. She wasn't. She didn't have the reputation of an lawyer. And she was a girl. That counted probably double against her. But yes, the story apparently is that she continued doing her own science and a remarkable woman. Yes, sir.
Do you believe the Swiss team that is defending its title in America's Cup these days was aware of that book? The last book you mentioned, they may have won because of that.
No, I'm sorry, I don't.
Perfect timing.
I'm sorry, I don't. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just curious, did any of his children follow in his footsteps?
Did any of his children follow in his footsteps? Yes, his son, Johann Albrecht, was his secretary and supervised the publication of a lot of his work after he died. His son was named a minor member of the Berlin Academy and was also a member of the St. Petersburg Academy. Certainly not as famous as his father for doing original work. I mean, who could imagine taking a simple problem like this in which you're practically counting on your toes and say, let's use calculus to solve this. Infinite series is what today in America we call part of calculus. So let's take a problem like this. That's genius. On a small scale. But really not on a small scale. Tell you a story about Ed Sandifer in his book. In his book, he goes through these early papers of Euler, and he rates them. These are not that interesting. These are more important. This is the second highest rating in this early St. Petersburg period. This is a, quote, fundamental paper in number theory today. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, so Leonhard did some studies on pi. Was he advanced on his time, or
Studies on pi?
Well,
all I know is what's in the Introductio. Did he do any other studies on pi? The gentleman in the back, do you know of any?
No, not at all, but I have a question.
Well, I don't know of any other studies on pi. I'm sorry. But this gentleman then has another question, if that's okay. I'm sorry, I don't know.
What I'd like to know is if there has been a comparison between Euler's work and the general theories of relativity and the special theories of relativity, especially with his work on triangulation.
Has there been any comparison of Euler's work?
Yeah,
various theories of general and special relativity, and I don't know. I'm sorry. I just don't know. I'm not a physicist, so that's just out of what I'm competent to say about. Euler is so immense, you'll never get your arms around all of it. But I'm inspired. That's the best I can do. I'm sorry. Okay. These first. I have to take more one about things about these, and then in fact we have one move. One of the first age makes the design of chicken and see was move back as an astronaut. And one of the things that then was that kid I can't do give you I don't have you give you my day here. One great with science campaign problem of the 18th century. Especially spent with English was to determine ocean longitude at sea. Very, very tolerable problem. And John Jarrett has some was the win competition in English office this whole or if you are a shot for 5 different methods of the turn on longitude. In face